Yes, I've been given these titles, as I've said, these essays by Satchidasa, who's now had the courtesy to turn up and listen to them. But they're really rather good titles, and I was especially sort of interested in this one. So let's see what I've got to say. So I found the notion of rootless society really very interesting. Even the metaphor of rootless sort of struck me quite strongly, not having roots. Actually, I think a more accurate way to put it would be a deracinated society. Deracinated means sort of having the roots removed or being removed from the roots. It's interesting because that is a word that's been in the English language since the 15th century. I did my etymological homework. But since 1950, its usage has shot up, which already tells us something. There needed to be a word for an experience that was obviously more and more common. So thinking about what rootlessness meant, what it meant for a society to be deracinated, I found myself thinking about my experience of rooted societies, people who were living rooted. For a start, I live in North Wales, in Snowdonia, in an area which is Bala. I live near Bala, which is almost entirely Welsh-speaking. And all my neighbours have been there for generations, literally generations. One of my neighbours he said that his family had lived in the house just up the hill, Blancwm. He'd been there for 5 generations, but they were newcomers. So I asked him, well, where had they come from? And he said, oh, well, Dolgellau, which is 10 miles down the road. Apparently genetic studies show a continuity between the mitochondrial DNA of people living there today and people living there in the Bronze Age, and perhaps even back into the Iron Age. It's actually astonishing, still in various parts of Britain there is that sort of continuity. That is rooted. So for instance, just recently there's a boundary stone, a stone that goes over a small stream, which is on the boundary of my property and my neighbours, the farmers next door, Rodri. And so I wanted to move it slightly because I wanted to put something there. I wanted to move it about 6 inches. So I went to Rodri, who, being Welsh, knows how to move a stone. And he took a look at it and he said, that stone's been there a very long time. And he was very reluctant to move it. That's what it means to be rooted. You feel that a stone, it's not that big a stone, belongs where it is, as he feels he belongs where he is. His great-grandmother was born in the house that in the farm that we now live in, and so on and so forth. So that's rootedness, and it knows everybody. Of course, they all fight, but in that way that people who know each other deeply do fight. So that was my first thought about rootedness. Then thought a bit, it's not just a country matter. I remember when we first came here to Bethnal Green, when we first started work on what now is the London Buddhist Centre, the burned out, wrecked fire station that became this wonderful place. The engine shed here, which was blackened, fire blackened. It was still an old, white, working class area, traditional East End Cockney area. And people had been here for generations. And they all knew each other, they all knew everything. They've all gone to Romford now and points east. But at that stage you still had a rooted community, and they felt very much they belonged to the East End. That's rootedness. It's not just a matter of country living. It's a question of place, of feeling this place is my place. This is where I belong. Of course, I work in India for 4 or 5 months each year as my friend Gautam will know in the front here. And he will know also that in India, particularly in rural areas, there's a very strong sense of rootedness. People belong in their village. Even when, 2 generations later, they still talk about Mera Gaon, my village, even though they no longer live there. There's a very strong sense of place, of belonging, and of course, huge family structures, thousands and thousands of relatives, with, again, all the proper quarrels and so forth, and rivalries that there should be in a close community. And yes, it's a very striking feature still of much of India. It's changing rapidly, and the middle classes are deracinated often in the cities, and it's happening fast, very fast. Again, I know it from gypsy communities in Hungary, where I have friends and connect with them. There's a very strong sense of bonding within the community, but to where they are for generations and generations. They were forcibly settled in the 18th century, and they've been fixed since then. But my most powerful experience was quite recently. I went to Ladakh, which is in northern India. It's a traditional Buddhist area. Tibetan-style Buddhism, it is Tibetan Buddhism really, is very much still alive, although it's under severe threat. And we're going to try to do something to help it decaying too rapidly. It's facing modernity. And that's what happens. Modernity deracinates. And it's happening really fast. But while I was there, we had a 2-month retreat in a retreat centre near Leh. And then a little party of us went on a long journey, a very, very hair-raising journey over 17,000-foot passes and with sheer drops on each side, and a driver who seemed to drive without looking where he was going, because the road seemed to, the car seemed to know where to go. At times it was a bit hair-raising, but where we were going was a valley called Zanskar, which until very recently was cut off for 6 months of the year. There's a 14,000-foot pass, which once the snows come, you couldn't get through. They do clear it now. The Indian Army clears it for strategic reasons. Yes, until very recently, it was completely cut off. So it's a very poor, but very vibrant area with wonderful ancient Buddhist monasteries which are decaying very rapidly. Anyway, I won't get going on all of that. But we were going to see a mitra, a Dhamma mitra of our order, somebody who's closely connected with us, who is from that valley. And he found a place for us to stay with a colleague of his. He's a school teacher. And this colleague has a guest house, and we stayed there, but it was more like we just entered their family. And every day they would feed us, and in the traditional way they would serve us while we sat down. We'd keep on trying to get them to sit with us, but no, you don't do that, do you? In India or in Ladakh, the hosts serve you while you just eat and eat and eat. And it was delicious food, and he prided himself that every day he gave us a different Ladakhi dish. They were really good, really tasty. I'll give you the address later. But so we would get talking to the husband, and he, Tinley, he was a Buddhist, very strongly convinced Buddhist, of a traditional kind. But he was also an educated man. He was a mathematician, so he'd been to a university in mainland India, as it were, in Chandigarh. And so he got very good English, quite very good, as it were, logical mind, if you see what I mean. So we had wonderful discussions with him and learned a huge amount about Ladakh. Again, of course, his family had been there for generations. In fact, they'd moved in the previous generation 100 yards down the road. So, and again, rooted. It wasn't just that he was rooted in place, he was also rooted in the local gods and spirits. And he showed us in the roof of his house a sort of bundle with juniper twigs sticking out the top, which was the family La. La, as in Lhasa, means God. And these were the sort of, well, what the Romans would have called Lares and Penates, the household gods, the ancestors, you could say. And these were passed on down through the family. And so he talked about this, and I was fascinated because this area of experience really interests me, and I think it's very, very important that we find our own equivalents for that sort of experience, because it's part of the deracination that we're cut off from the natural forces that have always been the companions of human beings. Sometimes they're enemies, but that have surrounded human beings from earliest times, and that they've developed a kind of way of interacting with, a way of relating to. So it's really interesting to talk to somebody with a modern education, and in a sense you could say a modern consciousness, who completely at ease with this this world of gods and spirits and so forth. Really interesting, and I think quite important. We can't recreate the gods and so forth. We have to have the equivalent sense of the world as alive. So rootedness is not just a matter of rootedness in land, it's not just a matter of rootedness in community, it's a matter of rootedness in the psychic world that surrounds us, the living world that is invisible and that is of the earth and sky and so on. That's what rootedness means. Well, I don't experience that. And I suspect most of you don't. Yes, I've been in Wales for 14 years and I've 16 years, and I'm trying to be rooted. I don't speak the language. My parents didn't come from there. And in a certain sense, I'm quite conscious I don't quite belong. And I try to keep a sort of healthy consciousness of that, an appreciation that I'm a guest. In a way, we're all guests, wherever we are. But that's what rootedness means. It means this very strong sense that this is where you belong, this is where you are. I've seen it in a Spanish village near Cuchaloca, our men's ordination centre. People have been there for generation upon generation upon generation, and they know everything about each other, and they're very happy to talk behind each other's backs about it. But that's part of it, if you see what I mean. But what it generates, what I notice, is people who have that sense of rootedness, is that they have a sense of deep ease with themselves. It's not that they haven't necessarily got what we would think of as psychological problems. Probably have them much, much less than is prevalent. In fact, there is evidence for that. I'm just recently reading some analyses of the incidence of emotional and mental problems, and it's much higher in places which are deracinated, and where people are much more rooted is much lower. So our society is probably, and again of course I'm very aware that people come from so many different societies in this very room, and some of you probably are familiar with your own background as rooted. You may be very aware that, where you came from, maybe even you come from the East End of London and you're aware of it, but you may be aware of your own background, and that in that background there is that sort of rootedness. Like David Mitra comes from the Northeast, and there's you often talk about your sort of engagement with that Northeast. It's had a very powerful effect upon you. I don't know where I come from. Probably the moon, I think. But it's not at the front of my mind that this is my place from which I come. My parents moved to the place where I was born just a year before I was born. And they didn't, in a way, come from somewhere else that was kind of their home. My father was Scottish. of Scottish origin, as it were, but far distant from Scotland. My mother was from New Zealand, which meant, of course, far distant from where her ancestors came from, Ireland and Norway. So, by the time it comes to me, I don't really sort of belong anywhere. And I think this is a sad affliction. I think it has a huge effect upon us. And as I say, it's almost overpowering when you meet people who have a sense of root. They're kind of almost frightening because they're just so solid on the ground. And you feel so twittery and light, particularly if you're from the white middle classes. You're sort of very light and as if you could be blown away. But people who just stand firm upon the ground, which they know they have a right to do. There's a health that goes with that. But unfortunately, the derooting, the deracinating, is going on apace. Even in India, where there's a huge rural community, people are emptying into the cities at a huge rate. India used to be almost entirely rural at the end of the British Raj. It was still almost entirely rural, but rapidly people are moving into the cities, partly to escape caste, for instance. Dr. Ambedkar told people to leave the villages because that's where caste is most easily enforced. So it's not always a pleasant thing, this rootedness, because it can become associated with oppressive systems of various kinds. But oddly, even some people I know from India who, a very close friend of mine, Dharmachari Sudarshan, who sadly died some years ago, came from an Indian village in Maharashtra, and where he suffered real direct casteism. I remember him telling me that they had, the Dalits, untouchables in those days, had a separate well, but their well dried up because, of course, they got the worst well. So one day they decided they would take water from the village well, that is the caste Hindu well, and his mother and the other ladies from the Dalit ghetto, you might almost say, went in a kind of procession with his mother at the front, and when she got to within 10 yards of the well, she looked round, there was nobody with her. But she went ahead. She pulled the water from the well. Over the next 3 days, the village went into riot. They had to hide, and so on. So he had that experience, and he tells that experience with obvious, very deep feeling, oddly not anger, but more upset. But he loved his village, and he loved village life. So it's a sort of strange contrast, that rootedness can even sort of not survive, but it can go on side by side with an oppressive system. Oddly. I'm sure that's true in other circumstances and situations. But yes, the deracinatory process is continuing apace. And of course it's made far worse, I believe, here comes the contentious statement, by technology. It's made far worse, and we saw that so vividly during the lockdown, when we were suddenly reduced to social connection through the internet, through Zoom and so on. And although, thank goodness, there was such a thing, because it would have been far, far worse if there hadn't been that possibility of that sort of connection. It would have been so much more difficult to face that isolation, which most people are completely ill-equipped for. You know, to me it was a wonderful opportunity for a long retreat, but that wasn't the experience of most people. And also I lived on a beautiful windswept hillside, rain-soaked, windswept hillside, for those of you who know Wales. And but for many people it was deeply, deeply disturbing. And you know that there's been a lot of study of the effect of lockdown on children. And I had a friend I spoke to just a few days ago who arrived in London as the lockdown hit to go to university. And so he was spent, whatever it was, how many months it was, years, wasn't it? A year and something, locked in a tatty room, looking at a screen, trying to follow classes on the law. And he's a very cheerful, very healthy sort of chap. He felt just deeply, deeply unhappy because no connection, just dislocated. So your deracination is not merely the deracination of removal from any sense of place and of belonging, but of real human contact and communication. It's amazing what we can do through Zoom, but it's amazing what we can fool ourselves that we're not missing. Direct human contact is more than just an intellectual thing or an emotional thing. It's energetic. And I said this on the first night, on the Monday night, didn't I? We come into an energetic relationship with each other. There's an exchange of energy. It happens to some extent over Zoom, but only if you really know people very, very well. And then there's just the power of a human touch. I've been advised by my acupuncturist to have 7 hugs a day. I'm afraid this just isn't in my culture. But still, I do it for medicinal purposes. What she's basing that on is the fact that studies show that a hug has a noticeable effect upon the whole nervous system and the hormonal system and so forth, a measurable effect. So removal from direct human contact is deracination on a deeper and deeper level than we've ever experienced before. And this is often said of old people, wasn't it? Nobody ever touched them. And increasingly, in Britain at least, we put old people in old people's home where nobody ever touches them. And during the lockdown, nobody touched them. And of course, when you're not touched, you sort of shrink in on yourself. So this deracination is going very deep, very far. And I'm not pulling my punches and maybe exaggerating a little, and each of us has to consult our own experience. But my own impression is that this deracination is getting stronger and stronger. I'm going to take an old man's privilege and say that in my day, when I was a young man, people were in much more vivid contact with each other. People knew their neighbours. There's much more sort of cooperation, and particularly as you move into the middle class areas, you just don't know your neighbours. And you don't really want to know them in case they're not quite nice people. Yes, in earlier times, even when I was a young man, just after the young boy rather, just after the Second World War. Yes, I'm that old. People had that much stronger sense of place, much stronger sense of belonging, and studies show that more people at that time were in the places that they were brought up. But it's gathering pace. There are advantages, there are benefits, like Dalits moving into the cities is an advance for them because they can get education, they can get decent work, and so forth. So I'm not trying to suggest that we should all just suddenly put down roots and never move anywhere. Some of us have to. Some of it's a great benefit to move. But nonetheless, there's a cost to us as human beings. And I think that loneliness and isolation are the chief ills of our times. I've only been told about this, so I haven't looked at this closely, but I believe this is reliable. The incidence of suicide, particularly amongst young men, is closely correlated with internet use. The more people are, as it were, addicted to the internet, the more likely they are to commit suicide, because you have that feeling of anomie, of alienation. You don't feel connected. This is horrible. It's awful what we're doing to ourselves. At the same time as we're kind of living a better material life. We can live longer. We can live in greater comfort with many more opportunities for entertainment, or otherwise known as distraction from our pain. and more loud and a strong sensation to compensate for an increasing sense of loss of feeling, of being deadened. So there you are. I painted a grim picture, but I don't think it's an altogether unreal one. You can contest later when I've gone. So what on earth can we do? We can't go back. Many of you haven't originated in Britain. So you can't go back because you're British now. You're here now. So I don't come from London. I don't know where I come from, but David Mitra's not going to go back to Tyneside, I don't think. No, he's not going back to Tyneside. So what do we do? What do we do? Well, we have to create a new kind of rootedness. A rootedness that's not to do with mere place, although I think place is still important. It's not to do with the ties of blood and kinship. It's not to do with those, as it were, almost automatic rootings that have taken place for human beings since the dawn of history. We can't go back to that. We've left the Garden of Eden, if you like. We cannot return to a sort of neo-pagan, I suppose. Pagan is of course a word for that sort of rootedness, because pagan simply means countryside. We can't go back to that. It's not possible anymore. There isn't the space. The places have gone. And anyway, we wouldn't particularly like it. It's too late. So we can only move forward and try to recreate what rootedness gives you in terms of a traditional society intentionally. We have to create an intentional community in which we feel we belong. So David Mitra nicely illustrated that for me by talking about our friendship. David Mitra and I come from the north and the south, and there's no further distance in Britain than that, the north and the south. We're from different drawers in the class system. You can guess which is which. There's a lot that could make it almost impossible for us to meet and be friends. But we are. We're very deep, old friends. Deep, old friends. And it's because we've participated in an intentional community. We've participated together in building Sangha. Sangha, I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, know, is the Buddhist word for community. But it has a very special meaning in Buddhism. It's not just any old community. It's a community that is united in the highest ideals, in the ideals of enlightenment. It's rooted in the Buddha's experience of enlightenment. It's rooted in the Dharma that he taught, the Dharma that he realized, as we spoke about yesterday. So that the Sangha comes together because of a shared commitment to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha in a more ideal sense. The Sangha in its highest sense means all those who've realized for themselves the truth of the Buddha's teaching and are moving, you could say, spontaneously, naturally towards enlightenment. So an intentional community in the sense of a Buddhist Sangha comes together because we all share those same ideals, those same values, that same idea about what it is to be a human being, what the purpose and meaning of our lives as a human being is. We come together because we share that very deeply. David Mitra and I are both order members. We both committed ourselves to those ideals, and that makes the bond between us. We do have similarities of cultural tastes and so forth, but we could not have that. We might have completely different tastes. We might have completely different interests. We do have different. He likes football.
Used to.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I used to play the egg-shaped ball. I didn't even like that. But for completely different interests. Anyway, we won't go there further because he's going to have the final word. But you don't have to share all interests. Today, you get these social media bubbles, apparently, where everybody comes together because they share the same interests or the same views. And of course, the whole thing is set up so that you're put in contact with that. I became rather fascinated by the inquiry into the January the 6th insurrection that already judges where I see it in the Capitol in Washington in America. So I just started looking at a few YouTube clips about it, and suddenly I find I'm being drawn into a whole body of interpretation of what happened. So if you click on one of those interpretations, you'll get a whole lot of others that agree with that. And you'll be drawn further and further into the bubble of those who see what happened in a particular way. So you have to pull yourself out and force yourself to watch Fox News and try to sort of listen to intelligent voices from the right, for instance. Because the whole emphasis is on just coming together because we share common set, let's be frank, of prejudices on the whole, or a common set of interests. That's what draws us together, and it doesn't really go deep enough, it doesn't go far enough. So we need something that transcends our individual interests and predispositions, predilections, that strikes at the depths of our lives, at what we believe in most fully and highly. We come together in that. And when we come together in that, but we share something very, very deep, but there's still big differences between us. Sometimes big cultural differences between us, differences of background. And we need to then work to understand each other deeply. But we do that because we share the same ideals. There's no reason to otherwise. Why would I bother to get to know a working class Tyneside who plays football? I'm very sorry, Teesside. I'm terribly sorry. He'll have his revenge. Why would I bother? Actually, I would bother, but if I ever actually got to meet him. But because we share the common ideal, we overcome the differences between us. I remember this, I was listening to Jnana Vacha's advert for a retreat. It almost made me want to go on one. But I remember my own first retreat. David Mitchell wasn't on that one, he was on my second retreat. But my first retreat, I was only there for 3 days, and I made 4 friends on that retreat who are among my closest friends today. And I experienced a completely different quality of friendship. I had good friends. I lived in a sort of loose community, and I had very good friends there. But just in those few days, I experienced a totally different quality of friendship because we came together in the same ideals as Manjuvajra, Dhammadinna, Mangala, and Marichi. They're still, whether I see them often or not, they're still among my dearest friends. Some of you will know them from round here. So when you enter an intentional community, you enter it, that is in the sense of Sangha, you enter it because the ideals are what draw you. And that draws you together with people from very different backgrounds, very different cultures. And this is something that's really urgently needed in our society today. London is a melting pot. People from all different backgrounds, from all over the world. I love it. I love it. I love going on the tube and just hearing all the different languages used and so forth. But I can't help thinking, it's working really well at the moment. What happens when the economy really dives and it's on the way? What happens? It's sort of kept in being by a relative degree of prosperity. When that prosperity goes, well, the divisions will begin to form, because when people feel deprived, they look to other people as those standing in their way, and so on. So yes, it survives because of a degree of prosperity. I've been in places where that prosperity is not there, and there is a great deal of intercommunal violence. India, for instance, at times, terrible violence. And in Hungary I've seen it. No doubt you can all think of examples. So we need something. The world needs something that draws us together from all our different backgrounds. We don't have to become, traditional white English, as it were. Do you see what I mean? We have to go beyond what we are if we're white English, and we have to embrace everybody. We can do that if we share a common ideal. We can come very, very close if we share a common ideal. If we go for refuge to the same Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha, that draws us far more closely together. You can do it in other ways, of course, outside that context. I'm not trying to say that's the only way, but it is the most effective, the most powerful for the dissolving of the barriers that stand between human beings, that we share a common ideal. We have to work. It's not just automatic that you just suddenly go beyond it all. You have to work. It's hard work. But it's in building that intentional community, that Sangha, that you decide you will create, that you will find a new kind of rootedness. I would say that I experience a rootedness that is kind of the equivalent of that friend I met in Ladakh. It's not the same, because of course, he has the history behind him, he has the land around him, he knows all the gods who live in all the hills and so forth. But it's not the same as that, but I feel rooted in a Sangha. I feel deeply, deeply rooted in a Sangha. And I can meet people I've never met before who are participating in that Sangha, as you all are. And I can feel an affinity with you, a deep affinity with you. I feel an affinity as human beings. There's something more than that. As human beings who aspire to enlightenment. This is one of our principles, main principles, that anybody who walks through the door becomes a member of our Sangha, at least for the period that they choose to be a member. If you want to make a real commitment, then you have to go through a process of training and eventually can become an ordained member of our Sangha through a number of processes. But everybody, right now, we're all participating in an intentional community. You've all come here to hear the Dhamma. You've all come to hear what I've got to say about the Dhamma. And we're all sharing the same perspective, whether you completely agree or not. At the moment, you're, I hope, following me enough to share a little in what I'm saying. And in that way, we come closer together. And this can take us very deep indeed. The promise of Sangha, the promise of building Sangha, is almost infinite, you might say. Because when you participate in Sangha, when you participate in this intentional community, where you're all striving to develop yourselves on the Buddhist path, what begins to happen is your narrow attachment to your own self, your own preferences, your own likes and dislikes, to yourself, your selfishness begins to dissolve. And you become less and less selfish and more selfless, in the sense that you experience yourself more as parts of everyone else. You experience yourself as deeply connected with everybody else. Even almost to some extent, you can have the feeling that you are everyone else. You can have that sort of feeling. And the growth of Sangha that takes you very far indeed, so that, well, we aspire to turn our Sangha into the Bodhisattva. We aspire to turn it into the consciousness in which we all participate, that endeavours to bring all beings to happiness. You can be a part of that. You can be a part of creating that. It's something that is individual, but not individual. that I participate in, which doesn't stop me from being me with my particular conditioning, my particular background, my passport, etc. I don't just become a blob that's dissolved into a sort of mush of a sameness. I'm unique, but at the same time, that uniqueness is contributed to something that is more than me, than merely me, a separate me. That is the promise. We can become what is called the Arya Sangha, or even the Bodhisattva Sangha, the Sangha of those who are selfless, who've gone beyond themselves. And this, of course, is the deepest kind of community. This is what community should be. And it, as it were, on that highest level, corresponds to that sense of rootedness. You're rooted in the highest ideals. And it grants one, to the extent that one participates in it, complete satisfaction, total confidence, complete ease, and a sense of a flow with all other beings, a sense of a deep interaction with all others, an ability to enter into the lives, the energies of all others. So, building Sangha in a rootless society is the answer to the rootless society. We have to deliberately set out to participate in Sangha and help to build it. And it's not that building is just an easy thing. It's not that you've got a Meccano set, do they have those still? Lego set, where you just put the bricks one on top of the other and there you are. It's a struggle, because other people, they're very uncooperative. Other people are the problem, aren't they? Well, no, they're not. We are the problem, as well as them. So it's actually quite an effort. David Mitra and I don't seem to have had much misunderstanding over the years, but I've had plenty of misunderstanding with some of my other friends and with other people in the Sangha. But it's through that work to overcome those misunderstandings, because you share the same ideals, that you grow and that Sangha is built. So you won't find, if you continue to engage here, that it's all perfect. Let me give you a health warning right now. It will not be all perfect. It will not be all smooth. There will be difficulties. You'll encounter people who act not as people should act. You probably find you're one of them. But you won't be all smooth and perfect. There will be plenty to work on. But it has to be done, if you see what I mean. It's an intentional activity. You have to participate in it. You have to commit yourself to it. And when you do that, you will find that you begin to sense yourself rooted. You begin to sense, this is where I belong. I belong in the Sangha. This is my family. This is my home, if you like. This is my place. It's through this Sangha that I can experience, if you like, my gods. That is the psychic forces that are everywhere around us in the universe. It's through Sangha that I can experience deep friendship. Friendship because we share the highest common denominator. Is that right? HCF, yes. My maths was a long time ago. The highest common factor, which is the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha. So I hope that I've inspired you a little to participate in building Sangha. And if you feel anything of what I talked about as this rootlessness, this sense of deracination, then perhaps you might consider that this is the route out of deracination, building an intentional community in which you work with others to create an ideal society in which we let go of our attachment to ourselves, our narrow attachment to ourselves, but we do not lose our identities, we do not lose our particularities, but they all contribute to something that is much higher, much further, much deeper. And I think this is not just for our own benefit. Let's start with our own benefit, because that's always the best place to start. there's a famous story the Buddha tells of two acrobats, a skilled one and his apprentice, and the master says to the apprentice, "You look after me, and I'll look after you." When they're doing the high wire or whatever. So the apprentice says, "No, you look after yourself, I'll look after myself." And the Buddha applauds this. That's what we have to do. We have to look to our own benefit, as it were, first, and out of that will come the benefit of others. So if you feel rootless, if you have some sense of deracination, if you even care about deracination for others, then this is something that you might consider. Joining with us in building Sangha and going through that work, that hard work, which is so rewarding, at times so joyful, so challenging, but which is, I believe, not just for our own benefit, but for the benefit of all. That if we can show what an effective community is, people will see it, they'll feel it. They'll see the way people come out of the centre. Your family will see it. Somebody was telling me about their own family and how that what's happening with them is then beginning to affect others in the family. And if you're at work, people will notice a change in you. If you're participating in a satisfying life and a satisfying community, it will affect the world around you. And we can slowly draw more and more people into Sangha. And that will be of benefit to the wider society as well, because it'll be a leaven, a yeast that will raise up the whole of society. So these are my few words on that topic, completing my series on Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha. Thank you, Satchidasa, for a very challenging set of titles. And thank you all for attending over these days. Some of you have been very faithful. I'm sure some of you who haven't apparently have been on YouTube or have been doing something very worthy. But it's been a great pleasure to me to talk to you, and it's an extremely good audience. And of course, it's the audience that gets the speaker to give anything, if you see what I mean. So thank you so much. And I hope to see you when I next come to the LBC.